My name is Jacqueline Harper. I've begun my work on the Harper Codex, and today I will continue my quest. I'm going to meet someone. This time, not an entity or a demon. Instead, a human who has been having similar issues with the supernatural. The idea of an encounter with a human was a new one. I have already met with a succubus, a vampire, and what I'm guessing was a ghost. All of these entities have been added to the Harper Codex. A human was a refreshing change, especially one like him. I was eager to meet with him to discover more, and to compare notes, or he could tell me more about that fateful night that changed everything. I have come to meet Detective Romwell. He left a manila folder that simply said Harper, and it contained an invitation to meet at a motel. One with a particularly seedy reputation. I had no desire to be fooled by someone with less than honorable intentions, so I nearly discarded it until I saw other files containing the supernatural. Beings I've heard of before, and some that were foreign to me. It seems we are on a similar quest. The journey to the motel was uneventful. Located in a semi-deserted town with nothing of note, it was a place you could blink and forget. I arrived at the motel early to get a look at the place. There were some less than reputable people in the parking lot that I had no desire to speak to or interact with. Room 407. I tried to find it, but there were so many rooms. Strange considering the location. I began to walk in the direction of the office when the clerk gave me an unsettling wink and pointed in the direction of the room. I swiftly walked through the parking lot to the room. There was no time to knock. The door opened, and a questionable-looking fellow gave me an expression that was incredibly difficult to read. And I was convinced that was by design. His posture was stiff with no intention of laying down his guard. I couldn't help but wonder how long he had been there. I was early enough as it was, and it looked like he'd been up all night watching the door I stepped through. The room was small, crammed, and very much bare bones. I noticed as he held the door open for me, and I entered with a slight cough. The smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air, and he certainly sounded like he smoked regularly.
I take it you won't mind.
He spoke suddenly, catching me off guard. I noticed first the old tape recorder sitting in the middle of the motel's table. Then I noticed him point towards my jacket, specifically where I'd stowed my own recorder. I was admittedly impressed with how attentive he was, but he wasn't the only one who could read a room. Between the envelope and the way he presented himself, I was beginning to piece together what manner of person I was dealing with before I had even opened my mouth, and I was too polite to say anything. I began to take out my own recorder, a notepad, and pencil in order to sketch him. He took out a bottle of scotch, shrugged, and poured the liquid into a tumbler glass. It did not take long before I was ready, and we sat at the table together. Okay, for the sake of the recording, could you tell me your name and your occupation?
I hope just Romwell will suffice. I'm a detective, an independent one as of recent.
And for the recording, what species are you?
Sorry to disappoint. Just your run-of-the-mill human.
And, I know this might be painful, but could you explain why you reached out to me?
I hope you don't mind if I'm too vague. I'm looking for something important. Something that slipped. Your name came across my desk as someone with an interest in the more bizarre workings. Figured we could both benefit from a meeting.
It was hard to ignore a tinge of pain behind his eyes, one that had nestled in, the kind that made his tongue numb to the stiff drink pouring into his mouth. Perhaps there was a way to encourage him to speak, and there was always a way to get men to talk. Look, we're going to be here for a while. Can I order you some greasy Chinese? I offered, and considered it the least I could do.
Just orange chicken and rice is fine, thank you.
I needed him to talk. I needed answers. Afterwards, I could ask him what he knew about my dealings. I used a food delivery app, made our orders, and decided to indulge in some small talk. How long have you been working as a detective for? He leaned back in his chair. The soft sweep of the chair filled the silence.
I never really think about that. I was working with the police for over 10 years. 14, I think. Then last year I went private, so 15 in total.
He looked down at the glass of auburn liquid in front of him.
You'll have to excuse my lack of manners. Would you care for some?
I'd love one, I admitted a little too enthusiastically, waited and watched while he poured. Maybe if I made myself a little vulnerable he would open up. I could have sworn I saw a... There was a knock that yanked me from my thoughts. I put my hand up, stood up, opened the door and took the order absent-mindedly before paying a tip. As I brought the food back to the table, it was still warm and smelled delicious. I placed it in front of us before handing him his chopsticks that he agreed with a nod of thanks. I've had issues with law enforcement in the past. The first night I witnessed I saw one of my neighbors from my apartment block being attacked. I still don't know what it was. It wasn't human, I sighed, and he had a mouthful of food still. For a moment, he himself seemed otherworldly, sitting behind the wall of steam his rice was producing. He leaned forward after swallowing his food.
I take it your eyewitness account fell on deaf ears. They said it was dark and that you just misunderstood what you saw, or that you were frightened and hysterical.
I paused and remembered back to that fateful night. Yes. After that, I was in shock. I was overwhelmed, I answered, and gave a small shrug at the memory. Since then, I've met with a succubus and a vampire. Oh, and a haunted carnivore. I think the ringleader is still haunting me. You've been the first human I've contacted in person about this, I continued. I certainly knew my story, but I wanted his. And what started all of this for you? Why did you decide to contact me? I asked, double-checked my recorder and finished eating.
A few years ago, I could have been one of those cops. In that line of work, you deal with what you know, what you can see.
He spoke. His eyes looked longingly into the amber drink that sat in front of him. It was like he wanted to find an answer beneath the surface.
That changed for me a little over a year ago. There was a missing persons case that landed in front of me.
The cup lifted off the table, and the fortune-telling liquid disappeared into his lips before he continued. The sting of the alcohol still soaked into his words.
There was no trace of her. The kid had been yanked out of reality. No one had anything to point anywhere. A case like that will grab hold of you. I needed answers, but the more I looked towards the world I knew, the less I saw. Then I remembered.
Silence. There was an overwhelming silence in the room. It made me realize I'd stopped breathing while listening. I tried hard to look into his eyes, to find his feelings, but they were shadowed by the brim of his hat.
When I was a kid, I used to play a game with my friends. Innocent enough. until the game caused my buddy to have a seizure. And years later, when I was an adult,
I couldn't say for sure. Behind his speech, I swear I started hearing something behind me. Like whispers that hadn't quite manifested yet.
Not everything can be explained away with reason, so that's where I looked, at the cases that were deemed unreasonable, the strange, the impossible, people seeing ghosts or going mad, and I found a connection. It all spikes in April. Something about it, like a beacon, it calls to these events. So I started recording, documenting, so I had to look at every detail.
Romwell's eyes became visible as he pulled that hat from his head and let it fall to the ground.
I may have contacted you, Miss Harper, but you'd be wrong to assume I was the first to reach out. Do you remember the small details that night your neighbor was attacked? Like what you ate for dinner?
I flashed back to that night, feeling my teeth sinking into the Chinese food. I stared at him, questioning when he added,
The temperature.
I flashed back to that night, visions of me pulling my jacket around myself to keep the chill air out as I walked outside into the brisk night air. I snapped out of it when I caught a glint from Romwell's intense stare.
Or perhaps...
He reached over and grabbed a manila folder that had been resting on the bed. Clearing off enough room, it was placed and opened in front of me. Before me was a document with an eyewitness statement that I was all too familiar with. And at the top, I could hear his words before he spoke them.
The date.
The more I thought about it, the attack that had changed my life happened in April. It was connected to the April tapes. I leaned back in my seat and the realization continued to set in. It was difficult to remain on track. Still, I had to remember it was not me being interviewed. I felt an uneasy feeling in my stomach. This was a connection I did not expect. Still, I had a job to do. The month of April would forever be changed, tarnished with the opening of the unknown. My chopsticks idly rested in the air, and I had to force myself to ask the following questions. Can you tell me more about the relevance of April and any information you've discovered?
It's still early. I can only speak on theories and ideas.
Romwell spoke, pulling the paper back. I watched him stuff the file neatly back into the plain folder.
A year is an integer of time that humans created, so I'm unsure if April abides by our recording of time, or if the cycle is independent.
Romwell had nearly finished his food. I hadn't noticed him really eating it.
There had to be an initial event. Something happened or was created, and since then it's been influencing people and things. Effects linger and manipulate.
He reached up and scratched the side of his head.
Or, of course, I could just be chasing a ghost.
He chuckled through fading words.
Maybe I'm losing my mind.
His stiff gaze softened for a moment as he looked down at the table.
I've been hearing voices. I try not to pay attention, to keep my head looking forward. If April is something, then that could be a sign I'm getting close.
Voices? And what do the voices say to you? I asked. What was left of my food began to grow cold.
It's just whispers. Every now and then a word comes through.
Rommel began shuffling the containers in front of him, beginning to clean up.
It feels like they've been there all along. I just haven't been hearing them.
As his words trailed off, the room briefly flooded with a yellow light that pierced the blinds. The light vanished and returned once more before vanishing again. I could see Romwell's face tighten up as he lifted from his chair and walked over to the window. "What happened?" I asked, watching the detective create a small opening in the blinds to peek out at the parking lot.
I apologize, Harper. It appears we'll be cutting our conversation short.
I was on edge, hungry for this next piece of knowledge, but he closed the blinds and walked over to his seat, scooping up his garbage and throwing it in a nearby trash bin.
Told the kid running the counter to alert me if anything sketchy happened. Perks of being able to flash a badge.
Immediately, I realized the light filling the room must have been a warning. He paused, as though he remembered something. If they were looking for supernatural beings, I stood up, packed my bags, and kept the recorder going for as long as possible. Are there any others who are searching the same way we are? I asked. There had been others who had reached out to me that I had not answered yet. However, I had no doubts there were some who remained concealed in the shadows.
Knowledge is power. Untapped knowledge is something people are bound to be after.
Romwell swiftly stacked the folders. I thought more about the possible groups who may be involved and watched him. Remembering one of those folders contained my case file, I couldn't help but curse the thought of not seeing what was in the others. Care to share one? Perhaps I can help you with one of the cases and I can share with you what I find, I asked. It couldn't hurt. There was always an opportunity for further communication to take place. For a moment, his eyes scanned over the various folders, like he was recalling the contents.
A lot of these files don't have a happy ending.
His fingers dug under the pile and pulled out a folder.
Perhaps you can track down the thing in this one.
He reached out his arm, holding the folder toward me. I reached and grabbed the folder. Noticing a small business card-looking piece of paper peeking out of it.
You leave first. You leave fast. Don't get distracted. Drive around without destination for an hour before actually heading home.
I could almost feel the gap in experience between us, dawning on me that I needed to be more careful with future meetings. I shook Romwell's hand. It was quite pleasant to have a meeting without the threat of being killed, and packed up the rest of my things to leave. Still, the other people on the hunt troubled me a great deal. As I made my way towards the door, he stopped with,
Miss Harper.
And I turned to look at him, my hand on the door while I waited.
I don't mean to overstep your boundaries. However, I feel I should warn you. They say when you stare into the void, it stares back, but you and I, people like us, we are not staring into the void, Harper. We have stepped into it. We have surrounded ourselves in it, and we have screamed into it. The things that lurk there know all about us. We're just lures in a pond, hoping we can get answers before the next big fish comes along. You keep your wits about you. You hear?
I nodded my head both in understanding and as a farewell. I had a feeling we would meet again sometime. And with that, our meeting was over. I left the motel and followed his instructions, and drove around aimlessly for an hour. The winding, empty roads on either side, twisting and turning, similar to my thoughts. I didn't get the amount of information I wanted, and he left me with more questions than answers. I had a feeling I would be hearing from him again. As I drove along the winding, empty roads, my hand reached to flip over the folder, and the case was definitely eye-opening. And there was a name, William J. Fraser. For a second, I could have sworn I heard something.
I'm looking forward to meeting you, Jacqueline Harper.
When I arrived back at the hotel that had become my home away from home, I looked at my notes and realized I didn't know what happened to him. I chuckled to myself as I typed them up, before crawling into bed as the sun began to rise. I had yet another sleepless night, haunted by a succubus, a vampire's fangs, a doll's whispered words, and now, the month of April. And the April tape. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Harper Codex. Naturally, I would like to thank my guests for joining me. Detective Romwell, otherwise known as the April Tapes, has an impressive channel with an interesting backstory. Someday, you can expect to see Jacqueline's case on there as well. Romwell, otherwise known as author Jojo, is a talented author, creator, and a pretty good person. If you enjoyed his character, please do yourself a favor, check out the April Tapes and subscribe. He could definitely do with more subscribers. I would also like to thank Romwell's brother, Nathaniel, who created art for this episode. I would also like to thank Ram Murito Animations for creating the intro. He does amazing work, and I believe he is still taking commissions. Eden V created the following pieces of art as well. I'd also like to thank WeeklyCreeps for his audio editing. And last but absolutely not least, I would like to thank Tanner Stokes for creating the soundtrack. Did you work out who will be the next guest? Did you also hear the little Easter egg as well? Let me know in the comment section down below. All of their links are in the description below. If you enjoyed this and my other content, please consider becoming one of my Patreons. All support of the channel is greatly appreciated. Stab, subscribe, comment, and be sure to check everyone out. Also, merch for the Harper Codex is now available. Thank you for watching and enjoying this with me. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.